So, with the creation of Israel came growing conflict between Israel and the neighboring Arab states. And this is a conflict that started almost immediately with the creation of Israel in 1947 and continues all the way to present day. So, first off, when Israel was created, they immediately won a conflict over Egypt and several other Arab nations to gain more territory than what they were going to be granted by the United Nations. And over time, this conflict continued to erupt between Israel and Egypt and surrounding Arab nations over territory. And so the Six-Day War was one of the first big conflicts after the creation of Israel. Egypt planned this huge invasion on Israel, but Israel launches kind of this preemptive strike, and they almost completely destroy the armies of Egypt and Syria and Jordan. And as a result, they gained tons of new territory, including the West Bank, the Sinai Peninsula, Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, and actually tripled the size of Israel. But their victory in the Six-Day War has also led to growing conflict over that territory. It also led to many more Palestinians being forced out of their homes. As Israel continued to expand, these Palestinians are going to migrate to neighboring Arab states. And so the Palestinians that were displaced, some of them are going to go on to create the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And this was a group that operated out of places like Syria and Jordan and Lebanon. And their goal was to destroy Israel and take back that territory for the Palestinians and create their own Arab state in Palestine. And they're going to use a lot of terrorism against Israel to try to achieve this victory. The Yom Kippur War. This is a war that almost destroyed Israel. Egypt and Syria are going to launch an attack against Israel. And Egypt is going to launch a surprise attack on the Sinai Peninsula in the western, kind of southwestern parts of Israel. And meanwhile, in the northeastern part of Israel, Syria is going to launch an attack on the Golan Heights region. And so Israel is basically forced to fight this kind of two-front battle. And early on struggled. In fact, early on they lose most of the Sinai Peninsula. However, with some U.S. aid, ultimately they turn things around and defeat Egypt and Syria. And following this, we start to see some signs of peace. The big turning point is going to come with the Camp David Accords. The United States invites the leaders of Israel and Egypt to his Camp David retreat in the United States and basically forces them to sit down and hammer out a peace agreement. And ultimately they do. And following this, several other Arab states, including Jordan, Lebanon, and Morocco, they also agreed to the Camp David Accords. It's also, though, going to lead to a lot of the Middle East resenting the United States. And one good example of this is OPEC. The Arabs, after the U.S. helps Israel in the Yom Kippur War, they're going to retaliate with an oil embargo against the United States and refuse to import oil into the United States. And so this is going to cause oil prices to skyrocket. In fact, oil prices are going to quadruple in the United States as a result of this oil embargo. Since the Yom Kippur War, we have seen some progress in this conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. The Palestinians have been granted self-rule over a lot of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Under the Oslo Accords, Israel agreed to withdraw most of their settlers and troops out of the West Bank region, but there's still many issues left unresolved. There's still conflict over the Golan Heights as well as Jerusalem.